We believe health is the foundation that unlocks freedom. The freedom to live fully, to be an asset and not a burden, and to chase what truly matters. Through daily practices and proven frameworks, we are here to help you build deep health, find lasting peace, and live with your heart on fire. Welcome to the chase. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I am here with Ben, as always, and we are joined by our friend Chris Irwin, creator of Rare Sense. How you doing, Chris?
Hey, good to see you guys again.
Good to see you. We had you on in early December 3rd. We had you on to chat about something you've got that you've dubbed the mind killers. And when we were recording that episode, I said, we're going to have a series of conversations about these mind killers. So we did we talked about what mind killers are in that episode. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the first of the mind killers in that episode. So if you happen to miss that, folks, go back to the episode on December 3rd, because we're just going to roll right back into a conversation about the mind killers and specifically about the next two mind killers, storytelling and suppression. Before we do, Chris, I have a one-sentence descriptor of what mind killers are. I want you to tell me if this is right, and then give me a little bit of context for folks if they haven't, or if they just want a reminder as to like what these mind killers are. What are we actually talking about? Mm-hmm. And so here's my one-sentence descriptor, which is mind killers are obstacles or patterns of thinking that sabotage our mental fitness. Close? Good?
Yeah, definitely sabotage our mental fitness or sabotage our mind fitness. It's not necessarily patterns of thinking, because some of this stuff actually has to do with feeling, and some of it has to do with even sort of cognitive development, so to speak. And so it is, I would probably summarize it better as kind of mental behaviors or mental patterns that we have, so to speak.
And
propensities.
Conscious and unconscious or subconscious, right?
Yeah, both. Yep, for sure. And as we've talked about, a lot of this hinges on unconscious thinking and how we respond to that, right? Mm-hmm.
And the first mind killer that we talked about last time around was oblivion, the countermeasure to that being awareness. So part of that is bringing things from the subconscious or the unconscious into the conscious so that we can, in your words, we can actually train it like we do our physical fitness.
Yeah. I mean, quick recap on that, right? I mean, like you said, people can go back and listen to this. That component is so foundational because the ability to objectively observe, especially unconscious thought, chatter, as Ben and I would refer to it, is the first thing you absolutely must do. You can't do anything else until you can have that ability to do that.
Take it. Okay, so let's jump right into storytelling. I just want to read a little bit from one of your articles on Rare Sense, and we'll link to everything in the show notes and the listener guide. But you wrote this, which I thought was great. You are the author and the audience. And you wrote elsewhere, when I was in the thick of my negative storytelling, I thought everyone judged me the same way I did, but that wasn't true. They weren't even telling a story about me. They didn't care. They were too busy narrating their own stories. In all cases, there was only one main character and one person in the audience. It's the same person, oneself. I just thought that was such a powerful thought or idea or even metaphor that you are both the author and the audience. So let's walk into this conversation about storytelling, maybe with that as our start.
Yeah. Well, let's be clear. When it comes to mental behavior, the stuff that does not become audible in any way, shape, or form, that's true with all of it, right? Like there's one author and there's one audience, and that's true for everybody. That's a really important thing to just kind of hang on for a second, because so much of suffering is self-generated and literally has nothing to do with anybody else other than ourselves. And look, I had to have this conversation, just to pause real quick on this. I had this conversation with my oldest son. He's 17, and he's a figure skater, competitive figure skater. Anyone who's heard me on podcasts, I'm always talking about my figure skating kids. And he's also a very talented musician and is very serious about music and band. And he was doing this combo thing for the Winter Wonderland on Ice, like the Christmas ice show figure skating thing, where they were doing a routine, and then at the end of it, he like went backstage, got his saxophone, and then came out on the ice and does a sax solo on his skates. No, he's not doing anything technical while he's doing that, but still pretty cool, right? He's like done all this cool figure skating. He's out of breath too, and he's trying to blow into the saxophone and create music. Well, training for this, rehearsing for it, he did something that pretty much every figure skater has done at some point, which is he left his guards on his figure skates, which are the things that like protect the ice skates, right? So when you walk indoors, you're not dulling your blades. If you step on the ice with those things on, you like immediately eat shit, basically. Like it's slip and slide. Every skater, I think, has done that at some point. But he did it with the saxophone, where he's holding the saxophone. And the coach was like, "Get out here," and he ate it, and he like falls over. He's trying to guard the sax, but it dented it like bent the bell of it and got a dent. And it's a school instrument. It was a brand new Barry saxophone. I don't know what these things cost, like $7,000. And he's all upset about it, as you would be, right? Not really embarrassed, but just like, oh my God, this is a new instrument, and what's my band director gonna think? And he still had work he had to do that day in terms of rehearsing for the show. I had to sit him down for a second because no one else was mad at him. And I was like, dude, right now the only person that is beating you up is you. You're the only person doing it. So you got to get past this right now. Like, I get it, you're upset, but like you, right now, there's nobody else judging you for this other than yourself. And the point is, you can take that into, this is what people do all the time with themselves. So getting into storytelling a little bit. The whole point of oblivion awareness is, again, sort of getting this third-party perspective of thought as a starting point, of just treating it as any other stream of information. And that's good. We need to have that separation. But even when we do that, we get the separation, but then we're not doing anything with the thoughts, so to speak, right? We're not treating them a different way other than the separation. It's just that distinction. But then there are certain types of thoughts that can be problematic. So even if we elicit that response, or if we sort of bring about that separation, there's still kind of things that we then have to change the way we operate with them, where it's not enough just to say, okay, I'm separated, I'm objectively looking at this. It's like, yeah, but this is kind of problematic for me. The other thing about thoughts is they take us, generally speaking, in one of two directions, into the past or into the future. Right? They rip us from the present moment, by and large. Usually unless we're focused, conscious attention, which is on the moment, usually, everything else is like yanking us one way or the other. We're like worrying about something that's going to happen, or we're dwelling on something that did happen. And so where storytelling comes into play is the past stuff. And where this starts is there's kind of like a little bit of a build-up to this, but when people think of past thoughts, the word that comes to mind is memories, right? Like when we think of stuff from the past, it's a memory. And we need memories. Every day when we wake up, if we had no memory of who we were, we'd have a tough time navigating the world. So it gives us sort of continuity of our psychological experience. It helps us learn, right? There's all these reasons why we need to have memories. And people think that memory is the problem when it comes to sort of like dwelling on things in the past. It's not the memories that are the issue. It's, generally speaking, it's the stories we tell about the memory. Mm-hmm. And the example I always use is, I had sort of this incident when I was on active duty where I don't get into the details too much, but I had basically like an operational kind of letdown, where a situation where I didn't feel like I measured up to the level that I should have professionally. And from that day forward, for about 12 years, I replayed this story of like, you're a failure and you fucked up and guys don't like you as a result of like, you're a loser. And this was like a constant talk track in my head, like every day, until I sort of realized one day, like, why do I keep telling this story about this thing? And it had nothing to do with the facts of the situation. It had everything to do with the interpretation of those facts. And so the broader example I use with a lot of people, especially in the Boston area, is Bill Buckner in the 1986 World Series. And for anyone who's not familiar, Bill Buckner was the first baseman for the Red Sox in the World Series. And it was Game 6 of the World Series. They're playing the Mets. It's like the 10th inning or something. You know, I'm going to get even some of these details wrong. I think it was the 10th inning. It was extra innings. And Mookie Wilson's up to bat, and he hits this like routine grounder down the first baseline. And it's like right at Bill Buckner. All he has to do is like the most routine, scoop it up, step on first base. Now, they wouldn't have won the game. And this goes into a whole other thing about memory of like, I remembered this wrong, which tells us a lot about most of your memories aren't even right. They're not even accurate. But that would have ended the inning. The Red Sox would have been back up to bat, right? If they had won this game, they would have won the World Series. Well, instead, the ball goes through Bill Buckner's legs and goes into right field. Ray Knight, who's on second base, scores, and they win the game. And then the Mets won Game 7 as well. The Red Sox lose. And this is Curse of the Bambino. This is like, oh, it's destiny. And everybody, like in Boston, heaped all of the blame on Bill Buckner as if he lost the World Series for them. Meanwhile, like Bob Stanley had thrown a wild pitch, and there's all sorts of other things that go into play here, right? The thing that happened is that the ball went through Bill Buckner's legs. All that other shit is a story around that. And there's a whole group of people who are rooting for the Mets who told a completely different story about it. That was all about victory and their destiny, right? So the whole point of that is like the interpretation of these events where we sort of base our identity when it's stuff that happens to us is all a choice. It's all a matter of like, what story do we want to tell about these things? And that's a very natural human characteristic there because we love stories. Like this is kind of how we help come up with morals and lessons and teachings and everything, right? Like we're so, like storytelling is part of our culture. But when we turn it on ourselves and we take some memory that doesn't intrinsically have any sort of negative or positive anything, truly, like the worst thing that can happen to you intrinsically is not inherently like positive or negative. We spin it, that's the problem, right? And so what we have to learn how to do is recognize that and realize that we can tell a completely different story of this, or what we call reframing.
A couple things just to go back. First, I think that the fact that your son wasn't embarrassed when he fell on the ice, it speaks so much volumes to the environment that he's been raised in. Because I think that would be the natural default for a lot of people. And that's so far already like up the mental, emotional ladder, fitness spectrum. I think that's really, really cool. The other, when you were talking about the Billy Bean, but the Billy Buckner. In Boston, what you were saying, I don't think people outside of Boston recognize how deeply entrenched this storytelling was in terms of the Red Sox can't win. We are cursed. Like there's graffiti all over Boston before 2001 about like reverse the curse. It's like like we are. It was a part of the narrative. If you grew up in Boston, that because the Red Sox traded Babe Ruth, the Bambino, to the Yankees, that we're cursed. And they looked for all these things from Aaron Boone to Billy Buckner to the 76 World Series. It was just like, and what you're looking for these things to confirm your storytelling. Right. What was really interesting is that I don't think even people from Boston recognize Billy Beane is hired by new ownership. He's the GM of the Athletics, the Oakland A's, to run the company. He accepts the offer. 3 days later, he's like, I can't do this. I can't move to Boston. I'm going to stay in California. And the owner of the Sox is like, all right, well then, if you're not going to do this, who do you think could do this? And he's, I just blanked on the name of it. The young kid, the young GM that came in and ran.
Yeah, I don't know his name. I could help you out.
It'll come to me. Anyway, they're like, you need to get this, the kid. He's going to be the youngest. He's like 28 years old. He's never done this before. He grew up just like minutes away from Fenway. Yet he didn't have the same story that we all told ourselves as Bostonians. Right. He told himself, the story he said was, they never put together a true championship caliber team. They never had a true number two. We had Roger Clemens, but we had nobody else as a number two. So they had Pedro, they're bringing Kurt Schilling. They had no like real meat of the order. They built up this, and they built a real clubhouse and a real contender because he looked at reality, facts instead of interpretation. He looked at the actual facts in the actual numbers. And because he didn't fall into that false narrative, he was able to do things that no one had done for 100 years. It's just really powerful, like whether you accept these memories, these stories as reality, or you go, wait a minute, take a step back and kind of operate with them a little bit differently.
Yeah. And those like sort of cultural, societal
Theo
things.
Epstein, by the way. Theo Epstein.
Oh, Theo Epstein. Yes.
I just looked it up. Good job.
Those sort of cultural, societal, whatever, those types of things, that's kind of a thing in and of itself. The point is that the thing with Billy Buckner, that's like the whole town, and there's all sorts of other stuff layered on that. But the point is, like, with people that are not famous, that aren't doing things on world stages and everything, we still fall into this trap, but it's all internally based. It's all this just like you make up this bullshit about yourself. And the other thing is, we think that it is on sort of a world stage because we're the center of our own show. We are the actor, we're the lead, right? But we're the audience. And so we think we're the most important thing. And we think when something especially sort of bad happens or traumatic, everybody else is thinking about this too. And they're not, right? Like my son's thing, 5 minutes after it happened, nobody else was thinking about it at that point because it didn't happen to us. And if someone asked us about it, we would remember it, but we weren't dwelling on it. And that's the difference there. Is these loops that we get, this is referred to sometimes as rumination. The rumination is this sort of like loop that I can't get out of, seemingly, but you can. I give this example of sitting next to a Vietnam veteran at a dinner, and he's one of these guys who tragically was like, he just wore PTSD on his sleeve. He had like the service dog, and he was sort of like jittery, and he right off the bat was talking about his experience and just saying, that stuff just never goes away. And I was like, well, it's not that you're going to forget what happened, but like this story you're telling yourself can definitely go away if you want it to. This stuff never goes away is a story as well about like you're just reinforcing this pattern that you're in, right? This negative spiral, so to speak.
Yeah. I really like that addition that we are the author, the actor, and the audience all at the same time, right? That's really it's an interesting way to think about how we tell stories in our own lives. Let's pause to say thanks to a few sponsors, and we'll be right back to the conversation. We're sponsored this time around by Momentous, the supplement company that wasn't supposed to exist until I realized somebody needed to raise the bar in supplement quality. Visit livemomentous.com today and use the code EXCELLENCE to save 20% off your first order. While everyone else is still trying to hold strong to their New Year's resolutions, you're here making real commitments to your health and your performance. We salute you. Momentous understands that commitment, which is why they're trusted by all 32 NFL teams and countless collegiate sports dietitians. Instead of offering every supplement under the sun, they focus on nailing the essentials with bone-crushing consistency. That sounds painful. Like their NSF certified protein and pure creatine monohydrate. Try saying that 3 times fast. Every product meets their obsessive Momentous standard, ensuring you're getting supplements that actually work, backed by science, and that are rigorously tested for quality. Transform your resolutions into results at livemomentous.com with the code EXCELLENCE to save 20% off your first order. We're brought to you by Element, the clean, science-backed electrolyte drink mix that's changing how people think about hydration. Go to drinkelement.com/excellence to get your free sample pack when you make a purchase of any of their other products. Proper hydration is not just about drinking water, it's about maintaining the right balance of essential electrolytes. That's why Element contains the optimal ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium with 0 sugar or artificial ingredients. Human beings report better energy, mental clarity, and fewer headaches when they get their electrolytes right. Sorry about the rhyme right there. Get your free Element sample pack now when you make a purchase at drinkelement.com/excellence. That's the letters LMNT. It's a great way to taste the entire rainbow of Element flavors. Again, that's drinkelement.com/excellence. Okay, now let's get back to the show. I want to move a little bit into the countermeasure for storytelling. So again, as a reminder, countermeasures are sort of the thing we can put in place to begin to fight back against whether it's oblivion, whether it's storytelling. And the countermeasure to storytelling in your perspective, Chris, is gratitude. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that we sort of altered this a little, like everything you guys have, Ben, you've ever done. I've always respected this about you, is sort of you evolve it as it goes. You go, well, you know, we're going to change that a little bit. So even in working with Ben, I've sort of adapted the actual countermeasure to reframing. Like the whole idea is reframe the stuff. Now, I will say, trying to reframe stuff from the perspective of gratitude is ideal. So if you can get there, that's great. But it's not to say that we have to be thankful for absolutely everything that's ever happened to us. Mm-hmm. So let's use like trauma as an example. Like people talk about trauma, right? The traumatic, like going through trauma, and that's usually the thing that people have a tough time getting out of when it comes to some kind of past experience. Trauma is a little interesting because you can use that word in myriad ways. You can use it as like the thing that happened can be the trauma, right? It can be sort of like the lasting effects of that, like physically, but then it can be this sort of lasting emotional effects of that too, right? Like sort of like the mind stuff that carries on, and we sort of use that interchangeably. But that's the problem, tends to be that piece of it, right? Physical, like if we're in a car accident and the physical trauma, like that stuff will heal, assuming, right? Like you're going to heal, your body will heal. But the part that people have trouble with is kind of the intellectual, which is the storytelling aspect, and the emotional part of it, which is suppression, which is what we'll get to. And trauma is also something that, like, it can be something that happened to you directly. It can be something you witness, like you're on ground zero when the planes hit the tower on 9/11. Or it can be something like in my case where it's like you did something that you're embarrassed by or feel guilty about or something like that, right? It can be any one of those things. But so getting back to this kind of like reframing was I did some treatment called EMDR, which sort of opened my eyes to this, where they kind of, if people aren't familiar with EMDR, you can kind of look it up, but you kind of do some stuff with these like paddles that make tones and whatever. But a therapist kind of leads you through this like, well, what would you want to tell yourself about this situation? And you go through this process and like you come out of it, and for whatever reason, it just kind of makes you realize like, I don't need to tell that story. Like I can tell a different story about this. Why am I telling this? And so for me, it was an eye-opening experience, but it also made me realize, well, I don't need to do EMDR to like do this with anything else that I'm telling a story about. I can just do that on my own, right? Like I'm perfectly capable of that. And it goes back to when people say, well, you know, I'll always tell that story. Like that's a story too. Like, you know, you just like gotta kind of keep, but the whole point is like reframe it somehow. So let's envision like the most traumatic, like someone gets assaulted, is like physically assaulted, like terrible, horrific stuff, right? You could tell a story of victimhood on that for the rest of your life. And this is an incident, by the way, all these things that we're talking about are things that do not exist anymore, whatever they are, right? 9/11 doesn't exist anymore. Being assaulted by someone doesn't exist anymore. Ball going through Bill Buckner's legs does not, like the thing is gone. So the only place that it exists, that it manifests is in here, internally to somebody, right? You could change that story to, I went through this terrible thing and look how strong I am as a result, right? You can tell that story. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make the thing not terrible or whatever, but it's like, I'm stronger because of that, and I can actually go tell other people how strong they can be after something like that. That's a completely acceptable story to tell. And that's just a reframing of the incident. That's all it is. And to take it one step further, like you were saying, you can say, you know what, I'm actually thankful that happened because it gave me an ability to talk to other victims out there in a way that I couldn't before, and that kind of thing, right? Like I went through horrible chronic illness, and I could be like, oh, it was so fucking terrible, and you know, for a decade of, but instead it's like, no, that gave me such compassion for people that are in that same boat and taught me so much about how you can overcome this kind of thing on your own. And there you go, right? And that's literally just making a choice about the way you're going to frame the memories.
Mm-hmm. I really like the choice aspect to that. There is a difference between being a victim and a victim mindset. We talked about that before. There's somebody I came across Elizabeth Smart, and people might remember that name, kidnapping victim. The story she told herself after the event was, "I'm ruined forever." At 14 years old, she's kidnapped from her bedroom in Utah by a religious fanatic, held captive for 9 months, repeatedly assaulted, brainwashed. And then after being rescued, she struggled with shame and guilt. Society labels sexual assault victims as damaged, and she feared that her future was gone, like completely destroyed. Her mother, powerful woman, told her something else. And she said, what this man did to you is terrible, and there aren't words strong enough to describe how wicked and evil he is. But the best punishment you could ever give him is to be happy.
Yeah.
The story she told herself after that was, I am not ruined, I am strong. And she went on to become an advocate, leading national campaigns, written books, started foundations. She refused to let her past, the thing that happened to her, define her. There's a choice. There's completely a choice.
Yeah. And there's people that will even hear that and they'll say, yeah, but my circumstance, blah, 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 whatever. And the thing that you have to, this gets back to recognition of thoughts, is like, that's a story too. Mm-hmm. You're just compounding the problem, right? Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't go as far as, trauma. Like this shows up in like the small,
that's
little,
an extreme
tiny
example.
It's
right?
Exactly. Extreme examples are easier to exemplify because they're so extreme. But, as a coach of regular everyday people watching them work out, I see this manifest all the time. You can see it in their body language. You can see that, like, as they're training, they're like that. They're telling them the story of like, I'm just not the type of person that can push through hard things.
Yes.
I'm just not that disciplined. You talk about doing something like the Whole30, and they're like, I could never make it 30 days doing that. And they're just self-sabotaging before they even put a foot through the door.
Right.
This shows up in the smallest little ways of doing a workout next to somebody, and just immediately they go, well, I'm not as fit as her, so I'm like, right. And they just like give themselves an out right away because it's protective. That storytelling mechanism is protective. We search for meaning, and meaning come in very, very different ways. Like the way we usually talk about meaning is in terms of impact and growth, but meaning is other stuff. It's like, when Elizabeth Smart telling herself that she's ruined, that's giving meaning to the acts, the horrific acts that happened in a negative way, but it's still a lot of meaning. It's not a productive one.
Yeah. Well, and this is why the reason we generate stories in the first place is generally because trying to find meaning in things, right? We're really not good at operating with sort of purposelessness and just like nothing means anything. So like meaning really helps us define ourselves. And so we look for meaning. And so when something sort of like we're good where it's like, hey, the story all works of my life and everything. But then when there's like this thing that sort of throws everything out of whack, it's like, well, that doesn't work with the narrative anymore. So how do I, and that's when it sort of will alter into like, well, I guess now I'm a loser. Because right? I have to derive meaning from this. And so it's, well, I was destined for this and blah, 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 and whatever, right?
Because we're such storytelling machines, we look for confirmation everywhere. So we say like, I just could never do the Whole30. You don't start the Whole30. And you go, see, I can't do that. Or you start like, I don't have the discipline to make it through that. You sign up for the first day, you fail the first day, and you go, see, like, I just don't have that. And we just want to we have such a confirmation bias that we'll look for ways to reinforce our story. If that is the case, because we're kind of stacking the deck against people, and reframing is the countermeasure, what are the steps? What are the tools to, when people recognize this, if they have step one, if they have the awareness, they're not in oblivion, they can hear themselves telling a story. How do we start to reframe this thing?
Yeah. So in terms of actionable stuff, right? And we always try and make this actionable. It's like theory's great, but like, what do we do about this? So when it comes to oblivion and awareness, we talked a lot about basic sort of meditation practices, like just getting in touch with like noticing what's going on with the thought process, spending some time doing nothing to just like feel what that's like, and just get familiar with the way thoughts can rip you away from whatever it is you're doing, right? Now it's a question of like zeroing in a little bit on what's that saying a lot of the time, right? When it comes to like, so it's usually a storytelling thing is like, it's a repetitive pattern. So a lot of times chatter is just sort of bullshit, and it's stuff that's like, has to do with what I did yesterday. But like, typically we're talking about chatter that is repetitive, right? It's patternistic. And so what the way to sort of start analyzing this is, if we're doing some kind of meditative practice, it's like, now we're going to start to write some stuff down afterwards. We're going to commit to some kind of journaling practice. If we're talking about stories, let's do some journaling, right? We're going to turn it into an actual story. So it's, okay, for a week, I'm going to do 10 minutes meditation in the morning, and then I'm just going to write down, I don't have to write down every single thing that cropped up, but it's like, where did my thoughts go for those 10 minutes? And be very objective about it. Just like, here's where it went. Like, I'm not trying to force anything. No judgment, right? This is really important too. It's just like a stenographer in a courtroom, right? Like, just literally write down what's being said. Reviewing that and going, okay, is the same thing cropping up a whole bunch here? Do I see the same kind of story, or even like the same kind of attitude coming up over and over again? Because that's when you can zero in on like, wow, I say this to myself a lot. And then the question is that a good use of, is that I don't like positive and negative. A lot of people say that positive versus negative thoughts. Like, I don't like it because negative thoughts can be motivating, right? A negative thought that says I'm out of shape can get you in the gym and make you healthier. So it's more, is this serving me? Is this useful? Is it ineffective? Is it destructive in some way? And so if we can identify that, then it's like, okay, now how do we counteract out of that? And so you may have to, like, what I've had to do is, I had this sort of tendency to a repetitive thought of sort of catastrophizing thing. This kind of gets into fear and things like that. But coming up with a mantra that overwrote that, like reprogrammed that, you know. But it could start as simple as just like, hey, I keep telling this story. Let me literally write out a better story to start telling myself. And then place that somewhere where you see, like, if you're really prone to this, write out your story in very simple terms, like on a sticky note, and put that somewhere where you see it all day long, where you can go, okay, every time that, again, getting back to the noticing thing, every time that story crops up, I'm going to start telling myself that story. Even saying it out loud can be helpful. And then the other sort of, like, it's associated to that, but getting into sort of the gratitude thing, right? Like, we really do want to get, there's almost a capability you can develop if you just start thinking in grateful terms. Some of this stuff will dissolve a little bit on its own. So, like, I was talking to a friend of mine, I turned him on to the 5-minute journal. Do you guys know the 5-minute journal?
Yeah.
Really simple practice, right? It's like 1 page a day where you just sort of set an intention, you say things you're grateful for. And it's basically sort of a gratitude practice. And he's had some trauma in his past and stuff that he's dealt with. And he's like, man, I've been doing that now for like a year. And it's so helpful for me. Like, it's completely changed the way I think about things, because you just build this pattern of thinking about things in a thankful manner. Mm-hmm. And it can be hard for people to start. You'll sit there, like, look, I've had times where I'm sitting there trying to think of one thing to be grateful for, and I'm like struggling. And like, the reality is, you have like thousands of things you could be thankful for in any given day, right? So I like that as like a morning thing, like a statement of gratitude on a yellow sticky. The same thing, you just stick it somewhere, you see it all day. And then an evening reflection too, of like highlights of the day. Just 3 things that like you're grateful for the day, right? Yep. Like, even if it was a quote unquote bad day, which is, again, is bullshit too. Like, that's just a story you made up. Like, there's no such thing as a bad day.
Let's pause to say thanks to a few sponsors, and we'll be right back to the conversation. We're brought to you by Mudwater, the coffee alternative that's revolutionizing morning routines with their blend of organic mushrooms and adaptogens. Head to mudwater.com, that's MUDWTR.com/excellence. Use the code excellence for up to 43% off your order. You know what I love about Mudwater? It's become one of my go-to afternoon pick-me-ups when I need focus but don't want coffee that keeps me up at night. Instead, I get clean, sustained energy from organic ingredients like lion's manes for focus, cordyceps for natural energy, and chaga for immune support. The best part, no more lying awake at night wondering why the heck I had that light coffee. Mudwater gives me the boost I need without the jitters or sleep issues. Head to mudwater.com/excellence and grab your starter kit today. Right now, you can get an exclusive deal up to 43% off your entire order, plus free shipping and a free rechargeable frother when you use the code excellence. Keep the energy natural and refreshing all year long with Mudwater, MUDWTR, because life's too short for anything less than clean and delicious energy. This episode is brought to you by the Defender, where exploration meets excellence. Discover the full Defender lineup at LandRoverUSA.com. Those who pursue personal growth understand that the journey matters as much, if not more, than the destination. The Defender family of vehicles embodies this philosophy, offering 3 distinct models to match your ambitions and the roads you choose to take. From the compact 90 to the 8-passenger 130, each vehicle combines durable construction with modern sophistication. Rich material finishes and practical storage solutions create an environment that's as capable as it is comfortable. Discover the full Defender lineup by heading to LandRoverUSA.com. That's LandRoverUSA.com. Okay, now let's get back to the show. Let's transition into our next mind killer, suppression. You write this. While storytelling deals with what we think about certain past occurrences, suppression concerns how we feel about it. More specifically, it's about how we respond to how we feel. Can you talk a little bit about what suppression is or what you mean when you say suppression?
Yeah, typically when we're talking about past thoughts, the way we interpret memories, you have those 2 issues, right? So we talked about a traumatic experience where there's a physical thing that might have to heal, maybe not. But then usually there's an intellectual component, which is the storytelling piece, how we're thinking about this. And then there's an emotional piece to it, which is how we feel about it. And the issue for a lot of people is that we don't process emotions very, very well. We just don't do it in a healthy manner when it comes to some of this stuff. So like if we have some kind of thing from our past where it bothers us for some reason, our tendency is to hold that in. And this can get kind of woo with sort of energy, stored energy and stuff, but this is absolutely real. And if you don't, read a book like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, like it'll convince you, like this notion of like storing energy, sort of destructive energy in various parts of yourself is absolutely true. And the thing that I sort of highlight for people is like, we think about memories themselves, right? What is a memory? A memory is, it's an experience that we have, and somehow we store that information, the data, in our cells, right? And like, we sort of take that for granted, like, yeah, but that's weird. If you think about it, like the fact that I can imprint, like I have an experience and somehow that information is imprinted in me that I can then recall. And there's a whole thing about how that works, and it's not how people think. It's not like a file cabinet where you just go like, oh, here's the memory and here's exactly how it happened. That's not what happens at all. But the fact that we can do that, who's to say that the only place that information gets stored is just in our brains, and just that it's information, right? That it doesn't have energy associated with it, positive or negative, whatever you want, however you want to classify that. The reality is it can get stored in different ways. And this can be really, really, really unhealthy for people. Men especially, and I don't want to get too, broad brush on like the genders and what we're prone to the way to act, but I can tell you from like a special operations standpoint, like spend a lot of time dealing with immense tragedy, loss of teammates, wounded guys getting blown up and shot, all this kind of stuff, where you do not allow yourself to process it emotionally, which is to say energetically, right? Mm-hmm. We just suppress it. We just like, well, I'm not going to deal with that right now. I'm not like, this is a perfect time where naturally I should be bawling my eyes out, and I'm just going to stuff it all down. And we treat emotions as if they're not required and this is probably my one beef with like stoicism, because stoicism can kind of go this route of like, just, it's not to say don't deal with your emotions, but just like think rationally about them and they'll all be fine and everything. Like, no, we have emotions for a reason. They are the way that we energetically process our experiences. So when something makes us laugh, like there's something like the laughing is like an energetic processing of that experience. And when something is sad, is sorrowful, crying is like an expression of that. It allows us to process that experience. But when we don't allow ourselves to do that, it's not like it vanishes, right? This is like, air pollution. It's like all the stuff coming out of people's tailpipes doesn't just disappear, right? It goes somewhere and it's toxic. Right. So the crude example I always use is like, it's like holding in a fart for people. It's like, can you do that for a little bit of time? Yeah. But like, if you kept doing that for 20 years, like how horrible would you feel? Like how toxic is that? And it is the same thing. Now, conversely, with a lot of like, there's other people, and this sort of, I think leans more towards women, where it's an anger problem, where they don't exactly know how to express anger correctly. And I think my interpretation is those things can a lot of times get sort of intertwined with one another because they're sort of the most volatile of our emotions. So men, not comfortable with crying, but we're okay with the anger piece. So we compensate for a lack of being able to cry by getting angry all the time. And you see this with guys, right? Like he's fucking angry all the time. And he's probably hasn't cried in like 20 years. Or vice versa, right? Like I'm always like, oh, it's okay, everything's fine, and and I'm gonna go cry by myself in my room, right? You have to figure out ways to not only do this healthily in real time, but the other challenge is figuring out how to sort of process repressed stuff, And look, I got kind of set on the path of this, kickstarted a little bit with some substances outside of the country where I was like crying for 4 hours, like screaming, crying. But it opened a doorway for me, which allowed me to then figure out where I could do this in the future. And the story that I tell is I went to see Top Gun Maverick, which great movie. Like I loved it. And I have I got into the Navy because of the original Top Gun. Like I went and saw that movie. I was like, this is amazing. You can do this as a job. You can be a fighter pilot. And yeah, I went to the second movie, the sequel, 35 years later, 40 years later, and I'm like, oh, this will be fun, this will be great. And man, I was so emotional from the jump on that movie. Like it was like that feeling you get, right? Of like, and I'm sitting there going, I don't know why I feel this way. I don't know if this is because it's pulling something from the past out of me. But the difference was, instead of just holding it down, which I kind of had to do in the theater because I know myself, like if I'm crying, it's like loud, it's like screaming at the ground, right? When the movie was over, we were there as a family, but we had 2 cars. I told my wife and kids, like, you guys are going together, I'm going to my truck. And I just got in my truck. I didn't even drive out of the parking lot. And I just like bawled my eyes out for like 15 minutes. But it's like a weight comes off of you. You're just like, whew. And the thing was, I didn't have to psychoanalyze it. I didn't have to be like, I wonder what that was all about. It was purely the movement of it that was important, And the last thing I'll say on this, just like where I started to really notice this for myself, was like a few years ago when it was like I was watching some banal animated movie with my kids, and there's some touching scene, and I'm like getting all, sitting there on the couch, like getting all choked up on this thing, just thinking, why is this doing this to me, right? And the reality is my body was trying to figure out a way to get some of this stuff out of me because it was so harmful and destructive. And it just was looking for any window. It was like, okay, here's something, let's try this, And at the time I was like, no, just same response, like just stuff it all down.
Chris, you've clearly thought about this a lot. You've done a lot of reading on it. Do you have is it so simple to say like, well, boys are taught not to cry and girls are taught not to get angry, and like that's the source of all this suppression? Or is it, I imagine it is, but is it much deeper? Is there reason for all this suppression beyond just like the sort of cultural story we tell ourselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. And again, I don't want to paint a broad brush. Everybody's unique and different, right? Just my experience has been, especially around sort of like alpha types, we tend to fall into that bucket.
Yep.
I think some of it is cultural. I think we're just, as Americans even, we're sort of like not wired to do that correctly. It's just kind of not in our DNA. I mean, you go over to like Europe and like Italy or something, like lots of emotion, right? Maybe too much, I don't know. But culturally, they're very wired to be extremely emotional. Like they get in fights with, not fist fights, but like they get in arguments with each other, but everyone's friends, and it's like it's part of the thing. Like that's part of it. We fall way too much into sort of, and look, I'm a huge fan of this too, and this is part of the reason why it was a problem for me. I'm very sort of empirical and disciplined, and think about things and analyze things, and not feel as much stuff. And so I had to shift that a little bit, like tap into like, well, how do I feel about this situation? Things even like intuition. It's not to say our intuition's always right, but like not always analyzing the situation from a thinking mentality, but from a feeling mentality too. And you can go too far that way too, where it's like, I don't even pay attention to the data. It's just, but there's a balance there that I think is really critical.
What is the countermeasure then to suppression? How do we start to feel our feelings at an appropriate degree?
I think there's
you don't hold in your farts. You already said that. You read Walter the Farting Dog. You learn the lesson, and you move on.
I'd like to say that my boys don't have any problems with that. So if you'd like to learn, come on over.
There's certainly there's things where it's just as simple as like you starting to recognize some of the stuff when it crops up, and figuring out a way, especially if you've done it for a long time. It's like so less crude example, it's like keeping the cap on a soda bottle, shaking it up, and then at some point, if you unscrew the cap, it's going to explode, right?
Yep.
So the better solution is, how do I figure out how to slowly unscrew the cap a little bit? It's tapping into that. Certainly it's figuring out ways, if you've got some sorrow suppressed, how do you process that on your own terms? People aren't comfortable crying in front of other people, but if you're uncomfortable doing it by yourself, like, and I was there, I know there's a lot of people there. It's literally by themselves. They're not comfortable doing that, right? So there's a little bit of that, but then it's working with your mind-body connection to get it better at energetic processing in general. So there's like breath work that can support that. There's things like Qigong, which I think can be really effective in this. I mean, exercise just on its own is part of this too, right? Like that can be really effective. But it's sort of thinking of yourself as an not just a material being, but an energetic being, and like how do I move energy more effectively through myself? So it's sort of a combo of those things.
Brene Brown talks about this, which is they feel something and they have a hard time, as you said, like feeling it, letting it out, because they have a hard time actually labeling it, and they might mislabel it. Right? So there's research that shows that when people are asked, they can really only identify like three emotions. It's like happy, sad, or angry.
Yep.
It's like, well, you might be really frustrated with your kids, but if you can't label it as frustration, it comes out as anger.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a level of, I remember reading this somewhere about, kind of a more evolved emotional intelligence is when you have the right emotion, the right amount at the right time.
Yeah.
And that's if you do that, then it really does get processed. But if you feel sad and it comes it actually, you think it's guilt, then that's a wrong emotion. It's like, or you have, as you said, you feel something, you don't let it out enough, you suppress it, you don't feel it the right amount, or you're angry for your dad for being abusive when you were younger, but you still hold on to that today when he hasn't been abusive to you or your family in 25 years. You're like, right emotion, right time, right amount.
Yeah.
Is there something like that in this?
The challenge there, the problem I think I have with that, that's not wrong, but it turns into psychoanalysis a little bit, where, again, we're getting too much into the thinking component again, where it's like, well, let's get the right label on this and everything. I'm more worried about the pure visceral movement of energy, right? So like I said, I've done some psychedelic stuff. I think those therapies can be helpful. None of the stuff I talk about is like go do these things at all. In the very small amounts that I've done some of these treatments, they helped sort of open my eyes to some things that I then realized like I could do these also in other ways, right? So it's not like you have to do any of that stuff to get there. But one of those was a couple of guided ketamine things with a therapist, right? Like legally in the United States, like you take, and technically it's a disassociative. I don't know that that's not just a distinction without a difference. But the end of one of these things, sort of apropos of nothing, no real proximate thought that would make sense, I had this sort of emotional release, and it was crying, but I was laughing at the same time. Like Joker-esque type response here. Literally, like, right? Like Joaquin Phoenix kind of like crying and laughing sort of uncontrollably at the same time. So if I were at that moment to go, what is this? Let me label it. Like, is this happiness? Is this sadness? Not the right question to ask. The question there, I think, is like, or the response I should say is, do I again resist this, or do I just lean in and let it happen? And then not really worry much about it after that, right? Like the therapy there, it's a visceral thing. And I think that that's the important piece of it, in my estimation anyway.
As a wrap-up question, Chris, we did a Chasing Excellence email. We put together a recommendation roundup recently, and you were kind enough to give us a recommendation. And what you recommended was perfect breathing, which I know is something you talk about in the article about the countermeasure to suppression. So just as a way to get out of this episode, could you talk to us a little bit about what perfect breathing is? Maybe give us some homework to do as it sort of relates to, working through this particular mind killer.
Yep. Yeah. So perfect breathing comes from James Nestor's book, Breath, which is a great book if you haven't read it. Easy read, very well written, just about kind of like the importance of healthy breathing. And he talks about the perfect breath, which is it's 5.5 seconds inhale, 5.5 seconds exhale, which translates to 5.5 total breaths per minute. And it's theoretically 5.5 liters of air. So there's like sort of this perfect sort of 5.5 balance across the whole thing. But the idea is like it's sort of the perfect physiological way to breathe, like through your nose, 5.5 seconds in, out, relaxed, very calm. Like there's no forcing. This isn't Wim Hof, none of that. And it mirrors sort of the way we naturally breathe, but it also mirrors kind of like the cadence of a lot of religious chanting and things like that, where we're sort of like getting in this very calm, energetic state, right? And so, yeah, I did a track on this with a sort of guided music track on YouTube that allows people to, like, you can do breathing where you're counting and stuff like that. I really like it where you don't have to think about it all. Let's get to the feeling aspect of this. So the whole idea is like there's like a sort of a thumping and just a tone that goes back 2 tones. So you don't have to count at all. It's just breathe in. When you hear the one tone, breathe out when you hear the other one, and you'll kind of hear the beat going through it. And to date, it's by far my most popular video on YouTube. People just find it very effective. I think there's something to it, again, of just kind of helping you get in an energetic state that allows you to move these things. And look, this is stuff that I think 5-10 years ago, if you'd talked to me about these kinds of things, I would be like, fuck off, like, that's stupid. So I get it if people's response is that, but I can tell you through vast amounts of experience that this stuff is absolutely true, and it is critical. You're an energetic being. Your mind is an energy. It is not a thing. The energy of that you have to take care of, and your emotional health is an enormous part of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. If folks want to check out Your Perfect Breathing, we do link to it in that January recommendation roundup. So head to chasingexcellence.email. You'll find it there. Chris, thank you so much. This is, again, part 2 of a ongoing conversation that we're having with you. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate the work you're doing. So thank you so much for the time.
Always a pleasure, guys. Good seeing you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you very much for tuning into the show. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening or watching so you do not miss another episode. For more frameworks and daily practices, visit chasingexcellence.email. And don't forget to tap the link in the show notes for today's full listener guide, where we break down the key ideas and provide actionable steps to help you put them into practice. Until next time, keep building health, finding freedom, and living with your heart on fire.